So we do need to be aware when we're working with our trauma clients that our clients' stories may well reactivate our own trauma histories. And I'm going to recount a story now which is upsetting, so I'm just going to warn you about that before I go any further. And it's an example from my own work with clients of a situation that reactivated one of the traumas that I have just talked about a moment ago. So I worked for some time with a client, and she was a nurse in an accident, an emergency department. And she was another client with a history of sexual abuse, and that was primarily what we were working with over many months. However, one day she came into the session and she said that she really needed to talk about a particularly distressing shift that she'd had at work. And she went on to describe that she had been involved in the looking after of two young children who'd been brought in after a car accident, both of whom were severely injured. And she had been attending the young girl who was about 6 years old. And as only nurses can do, she described in great detail all the injuries of this young girl and the procedures that they undertook to try and save her, but sadly that little girl died. Now, if that wasn't hard enough for me to sit and listen to, she then went on to describe that she had been given the task of preparing the child's body for the parents to come in and identify her. And the detail that I want to mention, because this was sort of like key to the whole final reactivation of my own trauma, was that this little girl's jaw had been broken. And it had been hanging off to one side, and she described in detail how she tried to rearrange this little girl's face to make it look more palatable for her parents to sort of like come in and to identify her. And as she was recounting this story, I was becoming more and more agitated as just memories came flooding through to me of my own accident at 8 years old. So this is an experience in my life that I haven't thought about, I don't really think about for many, many years, unless it might come up in conversation as people are talking about different things that they've happened, and I said, well, I broke my jaw. But I was becoming really flooded, and it was a combination of her distress and the recounting of that, and me sitting there, staying with her, being open to supporting her, and it all just came flooding back, me being in the ambulance, and the ambulance put on the siren, and the ambulance officer that was sitting with me was all big smiles and saying, oh, we're putting on the siren to make you feel really important and special. And I'm lying there 8 years old thinking, you think I'm going to die? So it didn't actually comfort me. So I had to work really hard in that session to stay attuned with my client, to self-regulate, to soothe my own internal distress at what's being reactivated. These are the kinds of things that we can be exposed to, every day that we walk into work. We don't know what our clients are going to tell us or how that may impact us on any given particular day. Maybe on another day that story may not have been so distressing. Maybe I was already feeling sort of vulnerable or whatever, which is why it had an impact that day. But we have good days and bad days, and that's something that's really important to take into consideration when we're thinking about VT. So we've identified that VT is a very normal reaction to working with individuals who are traumatised, and also that our own trauma history, if we have one, can interact with the client's stories and reactivate our own trauma. So let's explore factors that can contribute to VT. So obviously we've acknowledged that working with trauma is very, very difficult in and of itself. That's the most obvious, but it's not necessarily the most important or significant. Or there are other things that contribute to it. There are also confidentiality and content issues that can make us very vulnerable to VT as well. So in an optimum environment, we would regularly be able to discuss our work with our peers, with our supervisor or manager. And that provides an opportunity to help mitigate some of your own reactions around what you may have been working with. But that's not always going to be practical or possible. You know, many clinicians, you know, I've spoken to over the years who are working in agencies tell me it's really difficult to get a time to see my manager. You know, they're always so busy. There's so many of us that, you know, he or she hasn't got time to see us as much as we may need to. And if you're working in private practice, that can be really isolating too. There's many people in private practice who are working on their own, who may be working from home, and it can be really difficult to get a colleague on the phone. I mean, you know, how many times you try and phone someone, you get their voicemail, and then they call you back, and they get your voicemail. It can be difficult to, you know, maybe have the opportunity to talk to someone when you might need it. And confidentiality issues also mean that you have to be very careful what you say to people outside of the office. You need to be careful of not giving information that could potentially be identifying. And so as you're trying to sort of like talk about what you need to, at the same time you're filtering all the time, you know, what's okay, am I giving away something that may potentially identify someone and be problematic? And of course, you know, talking to your partner or your spouse is totally inappropriate. You can't go home and talk about your day unless, you know, maybe if they're in the same field you can, but again, those confidentiality issues are very paramount. But, you know, certainly if there's someone who's not working in the same field, you can't necessarily just sort of like go home and say, you know, this is what I had to sit and listen to today. And this is the case for a lot of professionals who are working with trauma. Not only counsellors, but emergency workers, the police, ambulance officers, military personnel, journalists. All those kinds of professions can be exposed to traumatic events. And it reminds me of in the late 90s, a reporter from 60 Minutes came to one of the conferences that I put on to interview one of the speakers. I was chatting to him while we were waiting for the speaker to become available, and we were talking about his coverage of that he did in Rwanda. And there was the reporter and also the producer who had been with him on that story in Rwanda. And as we were talking, the producer gradually became sort of like more and more sort of like, you know, pale and white, and then sort of excused himself. The reporter told me that since they had done that story, he had been suffering PTSD, and his relationship had broken up as a result of it, and of course their channel was not providing any assistance at all. So, you know, he was really kind of just sort of like less, well, you decided to do the story, it's your problem. And I'm sure that, you know, a lot of us will have had that experience of, you know, going home and feeling that you've got all this stuff inside, and you can't really talk about it. Then there is the nature of working with people who have experienced trauma. Obviously, people who've had some kind of trauma or abuse, they're very sensitive to issues of trust and betrayal, and that can really exact a toll on us as professionals. When you're with people who are hyper-aroused and hyper-vigilant or hypo-aroused, it can be very demanding of your sort of like your energy and sensitivity. It can be very difficult navigating our clients' transference. And being cast in the role of the perpetrator, which happens so often when you're working with clients, particularly who've got a history of abuse, whether it's physical abuse or sexual abuse. And as we're going to be talking about more later on, the transference issues and counter-transference responses can become very intertwined with VT. Then there's organisational factors that may be part of it. You may be part of a team that is stretched to the limit. So you're really working at capacity, and maybe your caseloads are really too big than is reasonable to be managing. You might be working in isolation, as I talked about before. You might be working in an organisation where you only have a set number of sessions that you can have with a client, and you know that you've got a client whose history is this big, and you've got very few sessions that you can work with them. And that can be very, very stressful as a clinician when you know that you're not even going to touch the surface of what the client's issues are and the help and support that they need. Working long hours can be also a contributing factor. Putting in long days really impacts your energy levels and your work. But we know another way of looking at this is sometimes I think that working very long hours could also be a manifestation of our VT rather than a contributing factor. And as Ian said in his introduction, getting rid of that word just, I will just finish off that report, I will just see one more client. That when we are trying to keep on packing more and more in the day, maybe that's one of the warning signs that we need to sort of like stand back and say, okay, what is actually going on here? Maybe I'm not sort of like thinking so clearly, maybe I'm not being self-protective